Well, this guy's name was Ziggy. He's the only Ziggy that I know of him. He said, you know, I was about 4 years old. And he said, I was playing with matches as a child. And Brother Randy, he said, I set my house on fire at 4 years old. Maybe 5, just a child. And he said the neighbors called the fire department, Brother Randy, and he said they came out and tried to put the fire out. And he said they got my mom and dad out, and I was left. He said, I still remember the blazes. And he said there was a big fireman come in. Big red-headed fella. He said he come in, he was as big as a mountain, I thought, Randy. And he said he'd come in and he had his fireman helmet on. He had that big jacket. And he said, I was crying and scared, and the flames were all around me. And he said he bent down to pick me up. And he said, just as he did, one of the beams from the roof fell and trapped him. And he said, he burnt to death, holding me in his arms. He said, when the other firemen come in, he said they drug his lifeless body off of me, and yet he sheltered me from death. He said, I was burnt all over my body, but he had covered me with his own body and with that big coat. He said, I carried that with me. He said, I carry that today. He said, there's not a day that I don't get up and think about that moment. I think, oh God, what was I doing playing with matches? If I just hadn't been doing that. And every day I think about that fireman that gave his life for me. He said, that was in New York City where I grew up. He said, later in life, I got a job, but still, every day I carried that. And he said, I got married a little later. My wife was having a baby. And they said it was going to be a boy. And he said that the day that the baby was born, he said, before I named the baby, he said, I left the hospital and I went to Station 49 in New York City. And he said there were some of the firemen that were retired, only about 2 or 3 that were there when the man was killed, saving my life. But he said they had a picture of him because he was memorialized in that fire station. And he said, I'm that little boy that the fireman saved my life. And he said, I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but I want to ask the permission of you firemen. Would it be okay if I name my little baby after that fireman that gave his life for me? And he said 2 or 3 of those old firemen that were getting ready to retire, he said, I looked and they began to cry. And the younger guys, they cried too. He said, you know, a funny thing about it was in New York back in those days, Tom. He said, I was Puerto Rican. He said most of the firemen and the policemen in New York City were Irish. And he said there was a bitterness between those 2 nationalities. And he said that the Irish kind of hated the Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Ricans hated the Irish. And he said my last name, I think it was Cologne, but he said, I named that little boy after the fireman. And he said I was raised Catholic, and when he got up just a few weeks old, he said I decided I would take him down and we would have him christened. And he said, I had told some of the firemen I'm going to have him christened. And he told them when. He said, my wife and I pulled up at the church. And he said, I looked behind me and here came, that's a true story. He said, I looked behind me and here came 2 fire trucks, Brother Randy. And he said they were loaded down with firemen from Station 49. He said as they got off of the fire truck, they were dressed in their finest regalia. I mean, they were dressed up. And they met my wife and I at the front door of the church. And they all walked in with us. He said the priest christened the child, and There were 17 firemen stood up. And the policemen, or the men that were there from the fire department said, we want to be his godfather. And he said, the priest looked up and he said, well, the form that they give us only has room for 2 names. And they gathered around and said, well, there's 17, there's 18 of us. And he told me, he said, I looked at the priest and said, can you just get another piece of paper and just staple it to it?